Good afternoon, everyone. We are back in the Writing Center with Emma and Abby again. Today is kind of a dreary, rainy, cold day, but we're here on a Friday just to talk to you. What we're going to talk about today, though, as we kind of head towards the end of the semester and follow up with our other two-part series in this podcast, is how now, if you are drafting a paper and you've been getting all the information, you've been doing all the right things, now what are the steps you take when you are ready to complete that essay? So we're going to talk about some different things that these tutors do when they finish up papers for their own courses. So I'll let I knew I was going to do that. Emma and Abby talk about what they do between, like, what steps do they take between that first draft and then actually turning in the paper? What are the things that they kind of check off and do before they give it to the professor? So I'll let you guys talk about that.
So after I do my first draft, I do like a 100 rereads just for like everything. And I always print it out. So I always have a printed out copy because for some reason I'm more likely to catch errors when it's printed out more than when it's on my computer. And then I'll always circle, I always have a colored pen, never a black pen since it's black ink. I'll always do like a purple or pink pen and I'll just circle any mistakes. And then I'll type it up again, I'll print it out. And then if I catch any more mistakes, then I'll do that. And then when either like a couple of days before the due date or actually on the due date, I'll turn it in.
Yeah, I do something very similar. The way that I write is probably not the way that a lot of people write, but I have a very hard time starting to write, But then once I get started, man, I can finish a paper all of a sudden, because once I get started and I get in my groove, it takes a lot to get me out of it. So the way that I like to write is I write almost, close to the whole thing, because like we talked about earlier in our podcast, we do our outline, and the way that I do my outline, once I'm ready to start writing and I get the motivation to start writing, I can finish close to the whole thing kind of in one setting. Now, mind you, it takes me a couple of hours, but once I do that, and I feel like I'm in a spot where I'm done, I like to close my laptop and not think about it, because sometimes I need to remove myself from my writing for, a couple of hours or maybe a day, and then go back to it, and then reread what I've written. And being able to reread it with a little bit of distance, makes it more as though I'm reading it being an outside reader as opposed to myself, who's written it and is knowledgeable about whatever I'm writing about. And so I'll go through and I'll read it, and very baseline in terms of my editing and my drafting. I start with the spell check on Word. Start there. Start at a baseline, fix all of my red and blue squiggles underneath my words, and I'll fix that. And then I do the same thing. I like to print it out, and I like to reread it. And the best advice that I have ever gotten at the college level writing is to reread my paper out loud, because I find that for me, whenever I reread it in my head, my brain's almost 2 steps ahead of what my eyes are reading, and I know what's coming next. And in my head, I might miss mistakes there because I know what I meant to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's on the paper. So if I slow down and I force myself to read it out loud, it kind of tricks my brain into thinking it's not something I've read before or something like that, and it's the first time I'm hearing it out loud as opposed to just inside my head. And I found that I'm more likely to catch mistakes just with like wording and style and clarity that way.
And I even tell students to do that. So when they come in and they're like, oh, well, I don't really get what's wrong with this sentence, when I tell them that it doesn't sound right, I read it out to them and like, see, it kind of sounds a little bit funky. And they're like, okay. And I'm like, you just have to like read it.
Yeah, that's the best, because you're more likely, I feel like, to catch, maybe it's not even grammar or punctuation or anything like that, but maybe it just sounds funky. You know, the way that you wrote it sounded right in your head, but when you're hearing it out loud, like, man, I don't think that sounds right.
Yeah, I think all of those tidbits of advice that you guys have are perfect, especially reading out loud. I think that's one of the best pieces of advice I think we all give everyone to read out loud. So basically, you guys were talking about all the things that you do between the drafting and the turning it in. How do you manage your time there? How do you take that deadline whenever your paper is due, and how do you break up all of those pieces you just told us about? What do you go by days of the week? Do you go by hours? Do you go by days you're free to work? How do you guys manage your time when you're looking at an essay deadline? What's your process for that?
Kind of, I think we talked about this a little bit in the last podcast, but when the assignment is given, I'll then look at it and I'll have an idea, and then I'll start outlining and drafting and everything. And then I never wait until the last minute just because that stresses me out. So I'll either do like a week before it's due, and then I'll start proofreading and everything, and then actually like studying it and seeing what's wrong, what I need to change and everything.
Yeah, I think you actually made me think of something when you were explaining that. But I think that more of like even the process of when you're beginning starts as soon as you get the assignment, because as soon as you get the assignment, you read the assignment automatically. Your brain starts thinking, well, I could go in this direction, but what if I go in this direction? And I want to talk about this thing. And so I think kind of that brainstorming process begins as soon as you get that assignment. And it's almost easier, once you get the ball rolling, to just keep it rolling. So for me, as soon as I get an idea, if I have an idea that I am really passionate about, or an idea that I'm really excited to kind of talk about, I take that momentum and I just keep myself, I'll get right into it as early as I can, because I know that once I stop, it is really hard for me to get started again. But kind of as like a general rule of thumb, with most of my assignments, or even like studying for exams, at a minimum I will start at least the week before it is due, which is probably still not even early enough, but right now it's the best that I can manage. I don't know, I just make sure that, whenever I get free time, I make sure that I'm doing something somewhat productive for writing or for studying or whatever it is. I think that the further we get in our college careers, the less and less free time we have. We have jobs or internships or extra classes or whatever it might be. So time management for me was a difficult hurdle to jump when I first started, because I went from having so much free time when I was at home and in high school and wasn't super involved, but then all of a sudden I'm here, and I almost feel like I do better when I'm busy, because it forces me to be more selective about my time management and when I'm doing things. And I don't know if you feel the same way, or
I think it depends on the actual size or like the length of the paper, because a lot of times when students come in, and even I do this, like shorter essays freak me out a little bit, and so you think that, oh, I'll get this done within 2 days, but then it turns out that you really don't know where you want to go with this short essay, and so you need to be able to allot time so you can actually get it done.
Yeah, I think it's the best advice, which is advice that I am still trying to work into my own practice, is that the earlier the better, because you never know what's going to come up, or you never know what questions you're going to have. And I think that writing is one of those unique subjects that does have all of these what ifs and all of these unknowns. That's a little bit different than, say, your worksheet of math problems. That's very cut and dry. I think that writing is just, a beast of its own, and the earlier you start, the more time you have to critique and edit and make sure it's in on time, and make sure that you're not scrambling the night before, pounding out like a crazy essay in like a caffeine-fueled frenzy overnight the day before. But with writing, the more time you allot yourself, the better it is going to be.
Because the professor's never going to answer the email at 10 o'clock the night before.
No. Definitely need to get started. Definitely need to get stared earlier the better. If I was a professor, I'm not too sure if I would answer that email the night before.
Both of you mentioned really great points about time management, and I like that you both talked about momentum and how you approach it, and also you mentioned how writing assignments, I think they just have a lot of different variables, and both of you have talked about this in all the podcasts, talked about it today. There's so many different things. You might think you want to do you're going to finish the short essay quickly, but then you start on it and you may not. You might start your research out and you go into a different topic. So students tend to get overwhelmed or intimidated, whichever word you want to use, because of all those variables. It's a much harder type of higher level thinking assignment to do because you're not answering 20 questions on a quiz that are from your textbook. You are entering into a really broad, abstract range where you're expected to write and think, or think and then articulate that through writing. So you guys are answering a lot of those questions, and I hope this podcast is helpful in the ways that we're giving you some ideas to handle some of those intimidating open aspects that you may not have encountered before. One thing we're going to talk about too today, just if you guys have any tips on it, were titles in your papers and how you put titles on, or if you have any requirements for them, things that you have to do. Give us some ideas on titles.
So I took English 101 and English 102 with Dr. Creighton, and she gave me the best piece of advice about titles. She said, do not even think about writing your title until you have finished the paper. And I used to be one of those people where I would, do my title before I even started researching, which is such a dangerous thing because you don't even know really in what direction you're going. Your title might be, about one thing, but once you get writing, it may have a different purpose by the time that you're done. And so she says that if you wait until after you have written your essay and you've written your paper and you have all your ideas down on paper, then go back and identify what your main topic is. It's a lot easier to get all of your ideas down on paper and then to figure out, what was I talking about? And that was one of the best things, because I can't tell you how many papers I probably turned in my freshman year where I would do my MLA header, do my title, and then all of a sudden my paper had nothing to do with what my title was. So it really helps, I think, the professor or any outside reader kind of narrow in on what you're talking about, So if they read your title and it has, to do with whatever idea you had before you started writing, by the time they're done with your paper, what the heck was that title talking about? And they spent more time thinking about what that title had to do with your writing as opposed to actually reading what you were writing.
Some sort of riddle.
Yeah.
What is
some
this?
cryptic secret message. And so
That
I don't
is
know.
true. I've
Yeah.
spent a lot of time thinking about titles.
Yeah, so
probably not with any intention behind it.
Right.
Your natural instinct is to, like, if the professor gives you a compare and contrast assignment, your natural instinct is to just title it compare and contrast essay. And I see so many students that come in, and I used to do that too, just because it makes the most sense. But it's also, you have to show like a creative side, and like Emma was saying, how it actually relates to your paper, not just some random thing. And in the business department, I don't know if this is different for nursing, but we aren't really assigned papers. We're assigned like essays and everything, but I mean, they don't have to have titles. So normally the professor's like, okay, whatever, you don't need one. But I always like to add one just because it shows creativity and it shows I actually care, I guess.
Yeah. Now, nursing is, when we do write, we'll write in APA format, and we do something that's a little bit different than MLA, and we have like a running header. And the running headers, in my experience, in the papers that I have written for APA, it's almost like more of a broad thing. And APA is typically used when you're doing like more technical writing, so you don't get to be super creative. Whereas you would be for creative writing or maybe like professional English writing. So in my experience, like my titles have been stress management. And so, I mean, it's descriptive and we know what I'm talking about, but, it's a little bit more cut and dry. So I think that depending on what format you're writing for, and of course the class is going to help determine, quite the creativity and, the level of description that you can put into it. But I think it's important to have one no matter what,
And I would say it's one of those little details that adds to kind of what Abby was saying. Like, you thought about the paper, you've pulled it together. It may be creative, it may just be technical, but it's a detail that reflects how you have thought about your paper as a whole. And speaking of, I think titles are kind of more practical things. How do you guys staple and print your papers? Where do you do that?
So I don't like, I don't have my own printer, so I use the printing services through Lander, because I know that I'm going to be the person where I'm waiting until 7:30 to print my paper that's due at 8 a.m. and I'm not going to have any ink. So I like to load that responsibility on Lander and their printing services so that stress is out of my mind, because I've never had a problem with Lander's printing and ink and everything. So I just make sure that I print it through there, because I always know that the quality is going to be really good, the paper's going to be there and the right size and all of that. In terms of stapling, kind of just as a general rule of thumb, if you are turning in a hard copy paper to your professor, always staple it, unless they specifically say not to, because I can't imagine how stressful it must be as a professor to get all of these pieces of paper that might be a part of this one essay and it might be a part of this other student's essay, but it was all just thrown on the front desk together, and because none of it's stapled. So just save your professor some stress and staple your papers. The library has several staplers available. So just, I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah,
but
like you said, a lot of professors do hate staples for some reason, and so they'll be like, oh, well, just paper clip it, because some of them like to lay the papers out in front of them and like look at every like single page for one person. But I usually just print the paper the night before, whether here at Lander or just in my room, and then if it's stapled, I'm very particular about this, but I always like stack them, and then I always do the staple like horizontal. I never.
I'm not a vertical.
I'm not a vertical person. I'm always horizontal.
Those people who do it diagonal, it's just like, how do you fold the paper then? You gotta I'm a horizontal person too. So.
But then some of the papers, they go through Turnitin on Blackboard, so you really don't need to turn it in.
Yeah.
Like,
Very
physically.
good point, and we didn't even really get into that as much today. Maybe that might be a good topic next semester, is turning it in through Blackboard, through turnitin.com is a little bit of a different process. So that might be something if you all are interested in, we can talk about. But I would say that both of you bring up a great point, that through the assignment, your professor has probably clarified whether he or she wants stapled at an angle, not an angle, paper clipped, not paper clipped. And for a lot of people incoming to college, that sounds very particular and kind of first world problem-ish. However, there's a method behind that, and it's kind of like what Emma was saying. When you get, if you're getting like 50, 100 papers, which some professors do every time they get a stack, they just need to make sure that every student's paper is getting graded and that every piece of paper is counted. I've had this happen multiple times to me, where a student will say, oh, you didn't get the rest of it, or it wasn't attached, and that has to be something to think about as a student. But just more practically, just some things to think about based on what Emma and Abby were talking about, where to print and all of those things. It sounds like from what you guys were talking about that the practical side of it needs to be a little bit of time left to make sure you have the printer is open on campus, or you have staplers, or you need to find a paper clip, so you have to go ask your roommate for one. So leave yourself some little padding of time there to do all of those more practical things that sometimes get overlooked, but can impact, depending on the class and the professor, can impact how it is turned in. Any other last pieces of advice?
I feel like no matter what you do, no matter what you're writing for, what class, professor, whatever their expectations are, or lack of expectations in terms of they don't have a rubric for you, just make sure you give yourself time. No matter, because if you have time, you can fix any problem that you come across. But if you are doing it the night before and you come across a problem, it could even be something as insignificant as no ink in the printer. But if you had time and you had a couple days, couple hours even, to be ahead of that, you can really almost tackle anything with writing, I think.
Starting even a day earlier than you usually do can really make a difference, because a professor can tell between a student who took like a week to write an assignment, whether one who took an hour. They'll be like, okay, they rushed through this, this isn't good.
Yeah, not only does it reflect in your quality of writing, but I think it reflects on your character as a student. and just how seriously you take the class, whether or not it's a gen ed that you're just getting to get your degree, or whether you were an English major and you're in like your 499 class at the very end. I think it just reflects so much more on just your ability to place a comma.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that, because the whole point of college is to kind of develop your ability to think, your ability to learn and kind of mature. So I do agree with what you guys are saying, getting really deep over there too. But I agree with what you're saying. But I also want students to understand that at Lander too, because we're a smaller campus, the beauty of that is that you should have all the resources at your fingertips. You shouldn't be afraid to talk to your professors. You shouldn't definitely be afraid to use the Writing Center. That is an element of time to think about. If you add in an extra day, I like that piece of advice because that's very realistic and doable. Add an extra day on, maybe add an extra Writing Center appointment to answer some of those questions that you might need answered, and hopefully you will be successful. So we will stop for today and pick up probably next semester with some more ideas, and we will talk to you then.